Our next panel, Navigating a Disentangling Globe, is about to start.
Do you have an order?
Nope.
What do you have?
May I sit next to you?
Ambassador.
Where do you want us anyway?
Yes, Captain Ibrahim, why don't you sit right here? Okay, Captain. Okay, we're ready to start. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Elise Labott of Zivvy Media. You might remember me from CNN. And today we're discussing navigating a disentangling globe. We continue to live in a period of turbulence and uncertainty resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic, climate-related disruptions, and now geopolitical tensions between the United States and China, and the war between Russia and Ukraine. World trade and supply chain challenges are starting to recover, but recovering in these resource shortages, high costs, lengthy delays, and bottlenecks remain. These disruptions have impacted business owners and investors' productivity and the bottom line, and they continue to pivot while questioning the next wave of unknowns. And we really have a tremendous panel to talk about how companies can successfully deal with this in global shipping and trade, what can be done to strengthen the future resilience of supply chains, and can technologies help, and how. I'd like to introduce my panel, Dr. Ibrahim Almojel, CEO of the Saudi Industrial Development Fund, Josette Sheeran, President and Director of Canoo, electronic vehicle company, Glenn August, founder and CEO of Oak Hill Advisors, Captain Ibrahim Koshy, CEO of SAUDIA, John Hadden, CEO of Alshaya Group, and Badr Olama, Executive Director of Mubadala. Thank you for joining us. Well, Dr. Ibrahim, let's kick it off with you and talk about how this is such a depressing atmosphere right now with the supply chain crisis and a lot of disruptions, whether it's climate and geopolitical tensions. Let's talk about how recent supply chains these shifts have created opportunities and growth potential in the Middle East.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. As someone said to me yesterday, the beauty of FII is that we are not complaining about the challenges we see, but rather try to come up with solutions about them, and we are optimistic about where the future takes us. For us, we see three trends. We see efficiency is losing to resilience, which is creating the supply chain movement. We see scale losing to customization, and cheap labor to automation. So efficiency to resilience, scale to customization, cheap labor to automation. What does that mean? It means that in the economic equation, capital is worth more than labor. It means that scale matters, but what matters more is access to markets that are underserved. And it means that big companies and large conglomerates are rethinking their supply chain. So that creates opportunities for people like Saudi Arabia, where we're open for business. We have access to markets that are underserved in the region, and we have capital to deploy.
Well, I'm going to go over to Captain Ibrahim. At SAUDIA, you're facing supply chain shortages, but at the same time, there's this increased demand for travel to the region, to the kingdom, and there are so many business opportunities. So how is this disorder in the world and the supply chain crisis, how is that affecting your growth at a time of increased demand?
I think it's on spot, exactly what you're saying. There is an increased demand. I think the way we're looking at it from an airline perspective, we've ordered additional, let's say, conversions of freighters are possibly on the way. We're growing our network, sometimes just fueled by the demand on cargo, air freight. On freight which was traditionally not via air freight. We're also looking at acquiring new wide-body aircraft. So, there's a lot of growth in this area. But at the same time, we've also been impacted by what's happening in the supply chain. And that's probably a different topic, but the way the airline is approaching it, we're part of the solution right now, growing that network, getting the capacity out there. And I think there's also another very important point, which we have to understand the environment we're operating in. I don't think going from a pandemic to a lockdown to getting people back to work and the inflationary environment we're in is going to change anytime soon. I think we have to understand, everybody on the stage, is that the supply chain and the inflationary environment is probably something that's going to continue for a while. And for us that are in the supply chain, in the air freight, air cargo business, I think it has to be put upon our shoulders to make this cost effective so air freight can continue to prosper, GDPs can grow, and business can grow. We have to be more cost effective. We have to be more listening to what our customers need, and getting the supplies, from point to point. And I think that's a very important point that we have to probably talk about at some point a little bit more.
Well, Josette, it's interesting that the captain brings up the whole, electric, thinking in terms of moving towards electric. You're standing up a high-tech EV company. You've announced many orders, but you have global disruption. How are you approaching and dealing with this need to kind of pivot and just find a new way of getting the job done?
Hello? I don't think any industry has been more impacted than vehicle production and the entire long supply chain. I will just say this panel was called Disentangling Globe, and I really think it's a reorganizing globe. And it's reorganizing around unprecedented stress on supply chains and the need to diversify risk. And I think we're going to see a regionalization and new opportunity for many countries who have not had a chance to be major players in the supply chain. Why? Because in every boardroom in the world, there's a decision to de-risk supply chains, to bring them closer to the source of supply. And so I think for the Gulf in particular, and I know Saudi Arabia is investing a lot to look at supply chains, if you have the energy, if you have transport, if you have the ability to stand up a supply chain, it's a chance for new players to come in, to look at seizing quite a bit of the business, particularly for regional distribution. And certainly for an EV company, we've done a few things. One is reduce the number of parts in our vehicle. Typical vehicle, a gas engine may have 30,000 parts. We're down to less than 2,000 parts. This has been very important to simplify, so the technology allows for that, but also to reshore many of the parts that America hasn't been producing, but also regionally source them for where our distribution is. I think this creates an opportunity, in particular in this region, where the demand for vehicles and electric vehicles is high, and the possibility to actually play a part in those supply chains.
So John, let's go to you. Under your umbrella, you have you have 4,000 retail stores, cafes, restaurants, leisure, and then you have a digital portfolio of more than 100 online sites and apps. So you're being affected across the whole gamut. How are you kind of pivoting?
Yeah, I think if you look at the last 36 months, we've gone through a pandemic, we've gone through lockdown in China, we've gone through a big change in consumer demand and an increase in prices. What we pay today, and we ship in 20,000 containers a year into these markets, is a significant increase in prices against the backdrop of all the shipping companies are making record profits. So how we deal with it, how we're able to supply, how we're able to put onto the consumer, for us, more and more is about localization. So what we are doing, especially in Saudi, is investing here in the kingdom, building facilities, warehousing facilities, food facilities, so that we are much closer to the consumer for two reasons. One, in the retail space these days, if you want to satisfy the consumer, you have to be as close to them as you possibly can. And second thing, just to abate some of the issues that we've seen over the last couple of years in terms of supply chain. The trick is not to have too much inventory in the market, and that's one of the challenges we're seeing. So this whole end-to-end process about how we bring product in for any of the brands we represent from the sort of 30-plus countries product comes from, the supply chain is one, but the more we can localize and be in control of our own destiny, we feel that's the ultimate protection as much as we can have it against what's going on globally.
Yeah, I think we're going to get into a little bit deeper into the localization. Badr and Mubadala, you are also, you're here in the region, but you're kind of sourcing from around the world. But localization in the UAE is obviously becoming increasingly important as well.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and it's a great pleasure to be here and talk a little bit about such an important topic because, not too long ago, we faced a situation with the N95 respirators. We faced situations with, the machines and the equipment that we needed, PPE, at a time when nobody was exporting. That showed us the vulnerability that we have in supply chains. And when you think about it from that perspective, when you start approaching that, geopolitics is unpredictable. Mother Nature is unpredictable. That means we need to change our thinking from just in time to just in case. And that's what Mubadala did. 20 years ago, we started investing. We invested in aircraft parts manufacturing, repurposed the capabilities to manufacture N95. We produce 4% of the aluminum to the entire world, serving vital sectors like construction. We have 5 satellites where we were connecting schools and remote areas to children so that education would not be disrupted. But that we foresaw 20 years ago because we started thinking not just in time, but just in case.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that, and I want Glenn to weigh in too, because there is a lot of talk that the just-in-time approach, Glenn, used to work really well in a kind of more stable, predictable world. But now this uncertainty has called the question into operating facilities just in time that are dependent on global supply chains. But at the same time, interest rates, right, are really rising. Adding inventory may not necessarily improve resilience, and it's creating stockpiles that are costing more, and capital is more, and you need more, capital costs more, and you need more of it. So talk to us about, the impact of inflation and cost of goods and how that's playing out.
So let me just say, I don't know how I ended up on the supply chain panel, but I think they thought it might be helpful to get an investor's perspective. And the more I chatted with some of the fellow panelists before the meeting, the more I actually thought an investor's perspective is worthwhile. For years, as we all experienced primarily a just-in-time, before we got to just-in-case, the entire world was focusing on global supply chains. Where could I find the lowest cost of labor, the lowest cost for energy, the lowest cost to build factories? And everything worked incredibly well for decades. Every year, part of the way we got low inflation around the globe was the efficiency of supply chain and also the benefits of not having to invest in big stockpiles of inventory. And I also have the belief part of the reason why we didn't have recessions in the last 30 years of any long magnitude is because we broke the cycle of big inventory builds that fell when demand just got destructed through a recession. Now, post-COVID, post the geopolitical challenges, what I see from an investor is that companies are totally rethinking their supply chain. They are onshoring, they are building more buffer inventory, and both of those dynamics, when you build capacity in a medium cost or a higher cost locale, it costs significantly more. Taiwan Semiconductor is spending $20 billion right now building chip production facilities in Arizona. They cost 30 to 40% more than if they did them in Asia. And as I listen to this panel, each person's benefit is someone else's cost. So air freight is being used now because that became better in some cases than shipping, but that was higher costs. And those higher costs get passed along to the consumer, and in many cases, the businesses have margin compression because they can't pass along all of those prices. So I think this whole move in the whole tightening and changing of the supply chain has very meaningful impacts. It has meaningful impacts to capital required to build new onshore or nearshoring capacity. I'll talk about some examples later. Perhaps it has more cost in carrying buffer inventory just in case, and it has more cost in shipping. And so the question from an investor standpoint is how do we profit on that? And I'll make it short for now, or wrap up now and comment later, but there's ways to play each of these businesses. In shipping, it's locking in long-term contracts with long rates. In aircraft, it's buying used engines because the transition supply chain is making Boeing and Airbus slower in building out their products. There's going to be longer usage of the old planes, and that's why engines are worth a lot of money. So there's lots of ways to make some money here and be opportunistic.
Well, you couldn't have teed up Dr. Ibrahim anymore, because His Royal Highness the Crown Prince recently launched the National Industrial Strategy to attract investments in supply chains to and from the kingdom, and it really is designed to position Saudi Arabia as a global supply chain hub. Yes, you're providing incentives to supply chain investors, access to resources and special economic zones to attract firms to base their regional operations here. What role will that strategy play in strengthening resilience of the kingdom and the global supply chain? And of course, it's also it could be a very profitable venture.
So first, my answer to John: to be profitable as an investor, you should come to Saudi Arabia. But as we heard, there is reorganization of the supply chain. There is a move from just-in-time to just-in-case, which is leading to additional cost. So taking the government perspective, what should the government do to help with the reorganization of the supply chain? There are three things we should do as government. First, we need to open regional markets. So not only by trade agreements, but also with shipping routes and ensuring that the logistics regionally are meaningful. Second, there is cost that's increasing now, not only in the setup of the entity, but even the transition, bringing the supply chain from one country to another. So we should provide capital support. And that is provided not only in terms of lending, but also support in automation, digitization, and in infrastructure, all available in Saudi at competitive rates. Third, which we don't usually talk about, that the reorganization of the supply chain, capital moves freely, equipment moves freely, people don't. So when we are reorganizing the supply chains, the government needs to invest ahead of time in the development of human capital to be attractive and make sure that the investor can make money. So as government, we need to open the markets, support and incentivize, and train the human capital.
Well, and that means sourcing local vendors. If you're going to source local vendors, you have to create the kind of ecosystem for that.
True. And that the challenge there would be not only ensuring the local vendors and SMEs are competitive in an increasingly difficult world, but that you have access to them. So I'll give an SIDF example. In SIDF, since the launch of the vision, and although oil is now high, but for the most time since we launched the vision, oil was at $30 or $40. Since we launched the vision 6 years ago, we approved and spent more than what we did in the first 35 years of SIDF. So 6 years of the vision is equivalent to more than 35 years. Why do we do that? It's to ensure that we have the local supply chain. We introduced new financing projects with banks and directly to not only help the SMEs provide to you, but to help you buy from the SMEs, to reduce the cost of accessing that.
So Josette, I mean, countries like Saudi Arabia and other countries looking to, change the supply chain and localize, they have a choice, right? You can move inputs in and be an assembler, or you can create that supply chain ecosystem, sourcing raw materials. That means IP, that means upskilling, engineering and manufacturing. You need to understand the markets. You need cross-border flexibility and taxation. It's not as easy as just, if you want to be an assembler, bring in the inputs. But if you want to create the ecosystem, that's a different proposition.
You know, we've witnessed another reorganization of supply chains, and it was really triggered in the late 90s when China set up the special economic zones and created kind of a green line around an area that made all the conditions ideal to set up a supply chain. And you saw textile manufacturing moving from Hong Kong and Taiwan to China. Today, we're seeing another reorganization, and it's not rocket science of what it takes to get it right, but it requires a vision from the top. It requires organization to facilitate not only the supply chain, but also certificate programs to train workers on the specific needs. And I don't think it's so much about college degrees as it is specific certificate programs to train people for the type of manufacturing excellence that's needed quickly. And that might be an 18-month program that could prepare them for that. I just want to say, Elise, I've seen this happen right here in the region.
Yeah.
Because the World Food Program that I used to run has to feed 100 million people in the world. 90% of the sourcing used to come from the US, Canada, and Europe. And then we set up a humanitarian hub in UAE, the humanitarian city, about 12 years ago. And this has become the biggest humanitarian hub in the region and in the world, but there's 6 of these, and we regionalized it, and it saved lives. It made efficiencies, and it had to build in the whole skill set to do that. So this has happened in this region. It's created a powerful example of supply chains that can work. And I think, again, one advantage here is access to the energy supply needed and the labor. A hungry labor market that really wants an opportunity for diverse jobs.
And just very quickly, Dr. Ibrahim, that's what you're doing at SADF. You're creating these programs.
Yes, so at SIDF we provide financing, and the SIDF Academy.
The academy.
We trained more than 8,000 people since the launch, since 2019.
Yep. Okay. Captain Ibrahim, the region is undergoing this real shift towards diversification from oil, and that's going to create that need for everything we're discussing. But we're not quite there yet in terms of local vendors. How are you managing?
Well, when we look at what's happening, I heard a lot about the regionalization, the local vendors, but it also gets me thinking about what's happening in the air cargo space. Right now, in Riyadh, right here, there is a new facility, the SAUDIA Air Cargo Terminal. That's going to be capable of handling, I think the capacity is 600,000 tons annually. It has facilities for perishables, for pharmaceuticals, vaccines. And I think what's happened, over the past few years has really taught us a lot about the regionalization, which was mentioned just earlier, and the efficiencies that can happen with that. So when you think about a 600,000-ton facility capable of carrying that much cargo and freight in a very efficient manner with the latest technologies, and it's as a new facility, you're putting logistics hub in a region where we're about 8 hours away from 80% of the world's population. There's a geographical advantage, and at the same time, from what I heard about raw materials and resources, there's a lot of that which allows us to offer that at a cheaper rate than other parts of the world. So I think things are falling together in a way for air freight, for cargo in the Middle East, in the region, in a very accelerated manner. I feel positive about where we're going in this. It's just the time's going to tell, how effective that was. And I'm sure we're going to adjust, as we go forward. But right now, the strategy seems to be well placed.
All right, they told me we just have a few minutes left, so I'm going to tick through a few questions real quick. Glenn, in this disruptive world where capital is retreating to safe, less risky ventures, many entrepreneurs, as we said, are struggling for capital. It's more expensive. How do we address this disruption in a way that we don't lose 2 to 3 years in the much needed innovations that are coming to market on this?
So
quick.
Real quick, I'd say that it does give the opportunity for government to be a useful player in providing incremental finance. And I also would add that when people change their supply chains and diversify them and move to other locations, whether it is Saudi, whether it is Vietnam, whether it's Philippines, that is great for the local economies. And I think it's really part of the vision here in Saudi is an extraordinary opportunity. I'm actually on the board of Lucid, and we're building a very large factory here. And I know a lot of supply chain work that goes along that, but I do think it's a combination. In the U.S., the CHIPS Act was designed to help provide some financing and give some incentives, and that's really what I think. That all being said, every good development has a cost. And the trend of globalization, as I said at the beginning of my comments, was great for inflation. Deglobalization will add more costs overall, which will lead to inflation, which will lead to higher rates probably for longer. So again, I think we'll need that support.
Quickly, I'm sorry, we're running out of time. Badr and then John, can tech, help us build resiliency against similar disruptions? How can we use AI to predict some of these shocks and pivot in advance to reduce the risk?
And I know we have time pressure, but I want to also somewhat debate the point about costs being higher as a result of actually having a just-in-case model. So let's take it from a perspective. You guys are in the automotive industry. You know what's going on with semiconductors. We are proud manufacturers of semiconductors with global foundries, but that's besides the point. What will happen when 80 to 85% of the batteries that is being produced in this world is done in East Asia? What happens when the supply chain gets disrupted, right? Disaster. So we need to look at it from two perspectives, and I'll touch the point on technology. So long-term, supply chain flexibility, right? We need to have that flexibility in the supply chain. Short-term, when we're building up that inventory, use AI, preempt, predict a crisis before it happens. Use digital twin to move your inventory around, simulate the trade flows, use 3D printing, print on demand. I mean, technology is there, but fundamentally, last point, fundamentally, use the 3 Rs. Reduce, reuse, and recycle, right?
John, pick up on that point.
I'm going to be just very quick, and I'm going to want to end on a very massive positive.
Yeah, wait, since we're ending here, I was going to ask the whole panel, and we'll do that super quick.
Okay.
It's all doom and gloom. Where's the silver lining?
So let me tell you about an example here in the region, here in Saudi, where the public-private partnership works, to what Dr. Ibrahim was talking about. So we have recently opened in Riyadh our own food production facility that supplies all of the 500 Starbucks we have in Saudi, all of the other American food brands we have here, and we've done it here in partnership with the government. The government helped us find the land, the government helped us in support with construction and everything, and helped us with visas and people. What does that mean? It means that we can source everything here. So if you walk into Starbucks tomorrow and you have a croissant or you have anything there, it will be made, manufactured, sourced, not just in this country, but by Saudis as well. And I think that partnership and that working together in this particular country is something we should all be very proud of.
And you're doing that as well, and you're working on that as well too. 20 years ago, innovation is here in the Gulf. Captain Glenn, where's the silver lining?
Just in case makes a ton of sense, but if there was no geopolitical issues, lowest cost would make sense. So I agree with you.
Silver lining. We're ending on a positive
Silver lining
note.
is extraordinary development in the region, in other emerging markets. That will address some of the income inequality in the world.
Captain.
Public-private partnerships.
Public-private partnerships.
I really think that we have to really work on focus more.
Right.
Silver lining, humanity cannot win the global prosperity Olympics by training one muscle, being over-reliant in one area. We have to cross-train, and I think what's happening now is a correction of an over-reliance on cost reduction rather than a multifaceted approach that can be a win for workers, for economies, and for regions.
Okay. Dr. Ibrahim, bring us home. Where's the silver lining in all this disruption?
It's excited, energetic, passionate youth. The youth globally haven't been, at least in the region, as excited, as passionate, as energetic, and as optimistic as they are now.
Yeah, and there's a lot of kind of enthusiasm and solutions-based discussions going on here on this panel and at FII. So thank you very much to the panel, and thank you.